brothers and sisters in Christ, have you ever asked yourself, when facing great challenges, where can we find courage and hope? Today, let us walk together through a profoundly deep story from the book of Exodus, the story of the 10 plagues that struck Egypt. This is a story that is not just history, but also contains valuable lessons that can illuminate our journey of faith today. As we look back at the dramatic events in this story, water turning into blood, frogs covering the land, darkness enveloping the country, and finally, the most devastating plague, the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian household, we see not just punishments, but powerful messages from God. These plagues were not only judgments against Egypt, but also a strong call to faith, justice, and God's faithfulness to His people. So can we recognize in each challenge we face an opportunity to seek faith and wisdom from God? These plagues also invite us to reflect on power and justice in our world today. They call us to reflect on ourselves. What have we done to protect justice and affirm the truth in the difficult situations? Throughout this journey, we will learn to trust in God's sovereignty, find hope even in hardship, and strive for justice within our communities. The challenges we face today, though not plagues in the literal sense, are opportunities for spiritual growth, to find renewal and steadfastness in faith. Let us delve deeper into the story of the 10 plagues, discover its profound meanings, and apply them to our daily lives. Together, we will walk the path of faith, freedom, and a deeper understanding of God's providence. The first plague, water turned to blood. Our journey begins with the first plague, water turned to blood. Imagine the mighty Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, suddenly transforming overnight into a river of blood. This transformation rendered the water undrinkable, killed countless fish, and disrupted the essential lifeline of an entire civilization. This was not just a natural disaster. It was a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt, especially Api, the god of the Nile. When faced with this strange phenomenon, the people of Egypt couldn't help but feel terror. The Nile, which they had worshipped and depended on for thousands of years, was no longer a symbol of life, but an image of death. Dead fish floated to the surface, emitting a foul stench, and the water supply for the entire nation became polluted and unusable. This event revealed God's absolute power over all creation, surpassing even the might of the gods worshipped by humans. It reminded us that no earthly power or force can compare to divine will. Through this plague, God declared that He is the sovereign Lord of all things, and no one can ignore His justice and power. The significance of this plague goes beyond its immediate physical effects. It symbolizes the futility of relying solely on earthly power and the inadequacy of human-made systems when confronted with God's authority. The Egyptian gods, though revered as supreme powers, were helpless in the face of divine intervention. Through this event, God conveyed that true strength lies not in the natural or supernatural forces that people worship, but in His infinite wisdom and power. We also see that each plague carries a distinct message. While the water turning to blood instilled fear among the Egyptians, it also serves as a reminder to us all of the worthlessness of human achievements without God's justice and protection. When we place our trust in material possessions or human authority, we can easily become distracted and fall into despair when external factors shake our foundations. This plague teaches us to respect God's power and serves as a warning against arrogance and forgetting His boundless strength. If humanity fails to be humble and obedient to God, its very existence can be threatened. The Nile, once a symbol of life, became a sign of death and destruction, demonstrating that God's judgment is inevitable when people commit evil and reject Him. The second plague, frogs. Following the first plague, where water turned to blood, another plague swiftly followed: frogs. Imagine not just a few, but millions of frogs swarming all over Egypt. They invaded homes, covered beds, clung to belongings, and flooded Pharaoh's palaces. Every corner of the land was occupied. Nowhere was safe from the presence of these creatures, from ordinary homes to the opulent palaces where Egyptians felt most secure and powerful. The entire nation was overwhelmed by the constant croaking of frogs, day and night. These frogs were not merely a nuisance. In Egyptian mythology, frogs were symbols of fertility and prosperity. However, in this plague, they became instruments of chaos and destruction. God transformed them from symbols of life and abundance into agents of disorder and punishment. The frogs did not bring blessings, but spread defilement and misery everywhere they went. The appearance of these frogs serves as a profound reminder that even things considered to preserve and sustain life can become destructive when they are not aligned with God's power. By ignoring God's warnings and refusing to let the Israelites go, the Egyptians turned even harmless, meaningful creatures into a burden. The frogs polluted the living spaces of people and tainted everything they touched, reflecting the moral corruption of those who rejected justice and obedience to God. This plague shows that God can transform even the most beautiful and natural things into instruments of judgment when humanity strays from His path. To the Egyptians, these frogs were no longer symbols of life, but clear warnings of God's unmatched power. Even things they were familiar with and revered, such as the Nile and animals they respected, could be turned into tools of punishment when they refused to change. This is a lesson about not underestimating God's strength and recognizing that no one, not even the most powerful, can prevail against His greatness. The world that humanity builds, no matter how wealthy or mighty, becomes meaningless when God intervenes to reestablish His order. Our existence does not depend on what we possess, but on our obedience and reverence toward God. The third plague, Gnats, Lice. Following the plague of frogs, another plague emerged, gnats. Imagine, from the dust of the earth, millions of gnats swarming into the land of Egypt, causing unbearable discomfort for both people and animals. These tiny insects not only bit and stung, but also brought disease and defilement. No one was spared, whether rich or poor, from the palace of Pharaoh to the distant villages. All suffered the torment of the gnats. This plague was not just a material nuisance, it was also a warning about the defilement of things beyond human control. God used these small, seemingly harmless insects to teach Egypt a crucial lesson about self-sufficiency and reliance on one's own strength. Despite their smallness and insignificance in human eyes, these gnats became a terrifying punishment, reminding us that even the smallest things in life can become destructive if we fail to live in accordance with God's will. This plague also illustrates that spiritual defilement, when left unchecked, contaminates every aspect of us. Gnats represent the evil and decay that we often fail to recognize, but that silently overstay and destroy our spiritual health, much like when we ignore the mistakes and sins within our hearts. When righteousness is overlooked and sin is not dealt with, these spiritual gnats multiply and disrupt the peace and tranquility that God desires to give us. The fourth plague, wild animals. The fourth plague was the wild animals. Beasts such as lions, wolves, or other carnivores suddenly entered Egypt, causing chaos and devastation. They attacked crops, livestock, and even brought panic to the people. These wild animals were uncontrollable, destroying everything in their path, from villages to palaces, wreaking havoc on all that Egypt had built over many years. Once again, this plague highlighted God's power over even the wild forces of nature. These animals weren't merely a physical disruption. They were a powerful symbol of humanity's helplessness in the face of God's intervention. No matter how prepared Egypt was, or how much control they had, when God decided to punish, no one could escape. The appearance of these wild animals signaled that, beyond the forces people worshipped and sought protection from, true safety could only come from God. His power alone could protect or destroy foes, and people could only find peace by living in obedience to Him. This plague also serves as a reminder that everything can change quickly. What we consider stable, such as civilization, control over resources, or power, becomes meaningless in the face of God's boundless power. Everything can be destroyed in an instant if we do not live in reverence and obedience to God. The fifth plague, disease on livestock. The fifth plague, disease on livestock, struck at the heart of Egypt's economy, bringing widespread devastation to their herds of cattle. A deadly disease spread throughout the Lice, killing the cattle, oxen, donkeys, horses, and other livestock by the thousands. This was a devastating blow to Egypt's economy, as livestock were a crucial asset, both as a source of transportation and as food. This plague demonstrated that God could reach into every aspect of the Egyptian way of life, striking at the very foundations of their society. The destruction of livestock wasn't just a loss of material wealth. It was a disruption of Egypt's stability. The economy and daily life of the nation were now in jeopardy, reminding us that no matter how self-sufficient we believe ourselves to be, all our efforts can be undone when we live outside of God's will. The disease on livestock also pointed to the idea that without God's protection, even the things we rely on most can quickly fail. It was a clear reminder that true provision comes from God, and that without His blessing, even our most prized possessions and resources can become sources of loss and destruction. It challenges us to reflect on what we rely on in our own lives, and to consider whether we are placing our trust in material wealth, power, or our own abilities instead of seeking God's guidance and protection. The sixth plague, boils. The sixth plague, boils, was a painful and devastating affliction where boils and sores appeared on the skin of the Egyptians, from the people to their livestock. These were inflamed, pus-filled lesions that caused intense pain, rendering them unable to view food or work. It was not only a physical torment, but also a humiliation, as these sores defiled their bodies, symbolizing the spiritual defilement of the Egyptians. This plague directly challenged the Egyptian gods, especially the gods who were believed to protect health and healing, such as Sekhmet, the goddess of war and healing. What the Egyptians had placed their trust in, these gods could not save. Once again, God demonstrated His supreme power over all the deities that humans worshipped. The presence of boils also reflected the spiritual agony the Egyptians suffered, acting as a sign of the corruption within their hearts and society. When people do not live according to God's will, everything that is good and healthy, whether physical, spiritual, or societal, becomes corrupted. The physical defilement was a clear representation of the spiritual decay caused by sin and stubbornness. Thus, the plague of boils reminds us of the necessity of inner purification and the understanding that when we live apart from God, not only our bodies, but our souls will also suffer. God is concerned not just with outward appearances, but with the spiritual condition of each person. When we separate ourselves from Him, the pain we endure is not just physical, but a stain upon our hearts. The seventh plague, hail. The seventh plague, hail, was one of the most terrifying plagues in the series sent to Egypt. This devastating hailstorm destroyed crops, livestock, and the property of the Egyptians. Large, icy, sharp hailstones rained down from the sky, crushing everything on the ground, trees, fields, and even homes. This hailstorm not only caused material destruction, but also filled the Egyptians with intense fear, as it was a sign of God's unrelenting wrath. This plague wasn't just about physical devastation. It carried a deeper meaning, emphasizing God's judgment on Pharaoh's injustice. God wanted Pharaoh and the Egyptians to understand that their oppression of the Israelites would not go unpunished. The hailstorm served as a stark warning about the consequences of stubbornness and refusal to heed God's calls. Pharaoh, despite his immense power, could not stand against the might of God, and every act of injustice would have to face the consequence. The hailstorm also symbolized direct judgment on human pride. We often believe we can control everything in our lives, from wealth and crops to health and power. However, this plague reminded the Egyptians and us that all we possess is temporary, and only God holds true power. What we consider secure and protective can be destroyed at any moment if we do not live in reverence and obedience to Him. The eighth plague, locusts. The eighth plague, locusts, was one of the most devastating plagues for Egypt's agricultural sector. Enormous swarms of locusts descended upon the land, covering it completely and consuming every crop in sight. There was nothing left. No grain, no trees, no greenery. The locusts ravaged Egypt's ended food supply, leaving behind only barren land. This plague was a direct attack on Egypt's economy and way of life, especially since the land relied heavily on agriculture. The locusts demonstrated how fragile human prosperity is and how easily it can be destroyed when God's judgment falls. No matter how much the Egyptians tried to prepare or protect their land, they could not stop the locusts from devastating everything they had worked for. The locusts also represent the consequences of ignoring God's will and living in defiance of His commands. Just as locusts can strip away all that is grown, disobedience to God can strip away the blessings and prosperity we take for granted. This plague calls us to consider what we truly value in life. Are we building our lives on the foundations of God's truth? Or are we relying on temporary earthly things that can be wiped out at any moment? Each of these plagues serves not only as a historical event, but as a powerful spiritual lesson, illustrating God's sovereignty, justice, and the inevitable consequences of turning away from His will. These events remind us to examine the sources of our trust and security, urging us to place our faith in God alone. The ninth plague, darkness. The ninth plague of darkness was a profound and terrifying affliction that covered the entire land of Egypt for 3 days and nights. This was not an ordinary darkness, but a complete absence of light, so thick that the Egyptians could not even see their own hands. They lived in fear and despair, unable to do anything in the absolute silence and overwhelming darkness. There was no light to guide them, help them work, or even alleviate the fear that enveloped them. This darkness symbolized more than just the lack of light. It represented spiritual ignorance, separation from God, and blindness in the soul. God used this darkness as a powerful reminder of spiritual deprivation, when people do not live according to His truth and light. The darkness was a direct warning to Pharaoh, calling him to open his eyes and recognize the absolute power of God. In our lives today, darkness can symbolize a loss of direction and a lack of faith. When we live without God's guidance, life can become dark and aimless. This is why we need God as our source of light and direction in life. Without Him, we stumble in the dark, uncertain of the way forward. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. The 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn, was the most tragic and decisive judgment that God sent upon Egypt. In a single night, every firstborn in Egypt, both human and animal, divided. This was a painful and sorrowful judgment, causing immense grief across the entire nation. from the royal family to the common people. No one was exempt from the devastation of this Lice. However, God commanded the Israelites to perform a special ritual to avoid this judgment. They were to slaughter a lamb and place its blood on the doorposts of their homes. When God saw the blood, He would pass over that house, sparing it from the plague. This became the origin of the Passover, a significant ritual in both Judaism and Christianity, symbolizing salvation and protection by God. This plague was not only a judgment against Egypt, but also a powerful symbol of God's salvation for the Israelites, whom He redeemed and protected. It was a lesson in God's justice. Evil cannot escape the consequences of its actions. But God also opens a way of redemption for those who trust and obey Him. The death of the firstborn marked the climax of the battle between God's power and Pharaoh's stubbornness. It was a definitive statement that human resilience and obstinacy would ultimately be subdued by God's judgment. Each of the 10 plagues brought to Egypt carried a profound message about God's supreme power, the futility of earthly gods, and the true justice He brings. These plagues were not only warnings for Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but also valuable lessons for us on how to live according to God's guidance, maintain faith, and seek justice in our daily lives. From the turning of water into blood to the death of the firstborn, each plague emphasized humanity's dependence on God and the protection, salvation, and justice He offers to those who follow Him. God stands beside those who remain faithful, protecting them from disaster and guiding them toward freedom. When we face challenges in life, I invite you to reflect on the profound lessons from the 10 plagues that God sent to Egypt in the Bible. These lessons are not just for the Israelites of ancient times, but for each of us today, in our journey of faith and when confronting the difficulties and struggles of life. First and foremost, we must trust in God's power. God holds supreme authority over every aspect of creation and human society. He is the creator of this universe, and His power transcends all earthly authorities. Trusting in His plan is essential, even when the circumstances around us seem bleak or incomprehensible. Just as the Israelites had to face devastating plagues, we are also called to trust in God's guidance in all situations, even those that may seem to be the greatest of trials. Next, we must accept faith in times of suffering. Trials are opportunities to strengthen our faith, and through them, our trust in God becomes more solid. Just as the Israelites endured each plague with hope, we too can find comfort and strength in our faith during difficult times. Faith is not just expressed in peaceful days. It is when we walk through the storms in the darkest hours that we must believe that God is near and will guide us through. Another important lesson is to uphold justice. We cannot stand idle when we witness injustice and oppression. God is just, and He calls us to do what we can to protect justice. Each of us is invited to reflect God's justice by promoting fairness, equality, and compassion in our communities. We must be those who speak out against injustice, whether it is in the family, the workplace, or the wider society. Furthermore, we must practice humility and obedience. This requires us to always be aware of God's will in our lives and be ready to respond to Him with humility. When we understand that obedience to God's guidance leads to true freedom and fulfillment, we will no longer fear or doubt in the face of challenges we face. Obedience is the path to genuine freedom, and through humility, we draw closer to God and to our brothers and sisters. An essential part of our journey of faith is the development of community and mutual support. We should not live in isolation, but nurture strong relationships and support within the community of faith. The community is where we find strength, hope, and encouragement during difficult times. By worshiping together and supporting each other, we can overcome all challenges. for God is always present among us when we stand together in love and unity. Finally, we must persist with hope. No matter how great the challenge is, we must hold on to hope and perseverance. We trust that God's timing is perfect, and He always works for our ultimate good, even if the outcome is not immediately clear. The Israelites endured for a long time, waiting for deliverance, and in the end, they saw that God never abandoned them. Through these lessons, we learn to rely on God's strength and His perfect plan, to support each other in community, and to persist in hope, knowing that God's faithfulness will never fail us. As we conclude, I invite you to reaffirm your faith in God's wisdom and mercy. Let us strive to become instruments of His peace and justice. Never forget that through faith, we can overcome any adversity. Just as the Israelites were delivered from slavery, we too can experience spiritual and personal freedom through unwavering faith in God. Thank you for joining me today in reflecting on the 10 plagues of Egypt. May God's blessings always be with each one of you on your journey of faith, and